If you're a writer, you should know what the 6 scene building blocks are. At least, it's something I wish was taught to me like this early on. I have all sorts of early writing I found frustrating since I wanted it to be better, but I had no clue what made one thing better than the other, even though I could tell there was something going on. Knowing that I'd have to focus on building these 6 skills I'll share would have saved me so much time. Really, it's a great reminder of this lesson I've embraced. What some folks call genius is simply intelligence and awareness applied with discipline. With that in mind, I'm going to give you some general awareness of the 6 skills that you need to use and develop to become better writers. And before the usual, you can do whatever you want, style, limitations, blah blah blah, sauerkraut pops up, here's what they're missing. There's a difference between creativity and craft. Art is creativity. Craft is skill. Creativity is the concept of ideas and turning those ideas into creations. Craft, meanwhile, is the stuff that gives shape to ideas and helps better communicate your ideas to others. Like with writing music, there are all kinds of things you can creatively do with this. But no matter what you make, you're still using all the same notes as any other musician. I'm giving a basic overview of what the notes are in this. If you wish to go deeper, I have videos I'll recommend at the end. Now, having gotten that out of the way, let's start with the skill most writers lean the heaviest into first: narration. Narration is the overarching account or recount of a sequence of events in a story. This part is where you're just guiding someone through a story, informing them of things. The narrative itself has 3 layers: the author's voice, the narrative frame, or the POV the story is told from, and the narrative voice of the POV character. When people mention show don't tell, often they're saying they want less narrative and more immersion. In the modern world, narrative tends to be more hidden, though you can use what is called classical omniscience if you want. It tends to be a bit more explicit here since the narrator is a character in their own way, but I have another video that discusses that more. Anyway, the basic thing you need to know with this is 1. Be consistent with what you're doing, and 2. Conform to the prose rules of whatever POV you're working with. There are many ways to choose what POV is best for your story you want to tell, but that's a discussion for another time. Just know that your choices here provide context for everything else, such as, for example, the second skill you'll use, internalization. If you're writing prose, I believe internalization is the most important skill you can develop. I've said this time and time again. It's the unique thing that literature can do better than visual mediums, since prose can immerse far deeper into a character than any other medium. Also, internalization is one of the things that helps us forge a connection between the reader and the POV characters. The reader hears their thoughts in a way we hear our own, and that allows the reader to share their feelings and concerns since they experience them as our own. Plus, the reader gets to know the character better, making them feel more real. The way this is done is with direct internal dialogue and indirect internal dialogue. Direct internal dialogue gives the reader the exact words that a POV character is thinking. Italicize it to indicate when it happens, and write it in first person and with present tense, regardless of the person and tense of the rest of the story. Indirect internal dialogue gives the reader an idea of the POV character's thoughts, but not the exact words they're thinking. Indirect internal dialogue, aka free indirect style, is best for blending in all sorts of info. Just make sure to properly set it up. First, make sure whatever provokes the internalization is on the page. Second, the order for any internalization is visceral response, emotion, thought, feeling. Emotion and feeling are different. Emotions are the involuntary responses to external events that fade after a short while. Feelings, meanwhile, are the conscious experience and interpretation of emotions. It's the subjective perception of emotions. The emotion is processed, and we become aware of it as a feeling. This is why people can feel different things in response to the same emotion. Finally, keep these 2 things in mind. 1. Unless you're writing in omniscient POV, only use internal dialogue for the POV character. Failure to do this leads to something known as head hopping, which is discussed much more in the Omniscient episode. 2. Only share thoughts that advance the story. The internal dialogue must be relevant to the plot, not every passing thought that flitters through their head. Now, while internal dialogue is obviously important, the next biggest in importance is regular dialogue. While dialogue itself can refer to any words said by any character to anyone, we're going to go with the traditional definition of it as talk between characters. Dialogue itself serves 3 essential functions: action, exposition, and characterization. With verbal action, this is what characters do to each other. It's what puts the emotional thrill on the page. It expresses what a character thinks and feels, and it's how they're trying to get others to do what they want verbally. So, with that in mind, consider what your character's goal is within a scene, what they believe, since this shapes how they'll try to achieve the goal, and then let it play out with barriers, resistance, and problems. This is especially great for exposition, since traumatized exposition is what you want to go for. As for what I mean by traumatized, it means the immediate conflict matters first, and the info it imparts second. You don't want to force words into a character's mouth to tell the audience about the world, history, or a person. Anxious beginners put expositional duty ahead of dramatic necessity. Make the dialogue intrinsic. Don't do something that opens immediately with a lecture on how whatever works or how some character just explaining things to another. Instead, be patient and work it in a place that would be organic to bring up something. With characterization, dialogue is the expression of each distinct aspect of the cast. Dialogue reveals characters through the way they talk, what they say, what they don't say, and so on. Also, dialogue itself should be stylish, dramatic, and character themed, since dialogue is not a real conversation. There's a great depth to this and techniques which I'll discuss in the future. Give me some time and I'll have you writing dialogue like this. Like the video if you find content like this helpful, Marcus said. Seriously though, I'm looking forward to covering it in the future. In the present, I want to cover this: dialogue tags and how to format dialogue. The purpose of dialogue tags is to help readers keep track of things as the story flows. With that in mind, I'm going to go a bit more into formatting with this one. Here's the things you need to know for formatting it properly. 1. One speaker per paragraph. It makes the dialogue easier to understand because they're able to quickly recognize a changing speaker, even before you identify who's talking. It also helps you limit the use of speaker attributions, which I'll get to in a minute. 2. Choose the correct form of punctuation. Use a comma at the end of a segment of dialogue when followed by a tag. Use a question mark without a comma for a question. If a tag is dividing a sentence, use a comma at the end of the first section of dialogue, even if the comma wouldn't normally go there, in the same sentence if it wasn't dialogue, and use a comma after the tag. Use a period after a tag when the first segment of dialogue is a complete sentence. Use a dash when dialogue is cut off or interrupted. Use ellipses for dialogue that fades away, and punctuation goes inside the quotation marks in North America. 3. Avoid creativity in your tags. The reason why is because of show don't tell related reasons. Again, see that video after this one if you want a further explanation. 4. You don't always need a tag or a beat to identify the speaker. If you only have 2 speakers in a scene, you can leave up to 3 or 4 lines of dialogue unattributed. 3 is the number most people can easily keep track of, and once you go further than that, you risk the reader needing to count backwards to figure out who is speaking. 5. Identify the speaker early. This one's a pet peeve of mine because I see beginners make this mistake all the time. I don't feel like explaining it over and over. When you have long passages of dialogue, it's usually best to either begin with an action beat, so the reader knows who's talking before they start, or to place a beat or a tag at the first natural pause. If you wait until the end of a long passage to clue the reader into who's speaking, you risk them assuming the speaker and being jarred out of the story because you belatedly tell them their assumption was wrong. Beyond that, I've said all you need to know here in my video on Show Don't Tell, which will again be included at the playlist at the end. Now, with dialogue tags, you will often have to choose between them or action beats. Action beats are the small actions and reactions by characters that are interspersed with the dialogue. They help convey emotion, set the scene's pace, or hint at underlying feelings. Visceral feelings, facial expressions, and body language are all part of what makes this up. On top of, actual action. At any rate, these are the little events reduced to stimuli and response. When handling these, remember not to reverse cause and effect. Focus on the action and cut out description and narrative in these cases. Avoid filter words, passive verbs, and adverbs. Why? The reason is covered both in the videos on Show Don't Tell. It's such an important video to watch, as well as clarity, the first C for strong prose. But before those videos, you need to hear about skills number 6, description. Description is what offers the reader vivid visualizations of setting, characters, and sets the atmosphere. The outward appearance of a setting or character is the subtext. How it's expressed reveals the invisible stuff, the subtext. It's gonna take me multiple episodes to go into depth on writing description, but I can give you these quick tips. Use adjectives sparingly, use and vary all 5 senses, show movement or motion, use simile, metaphor, or other rhetoric devices to convey mood, and the more specific the descriptive word, the better. At any rate, when people talk about prose, this is what makes up all that's about. You're free to practice these however you want. There's a lot of depth to some of these and ways you can practice it, but keep this in mind. Writing is subjective, reading is objective. Whatever you experience during the creation process won't matter to those on the receiving end. Still, you don't need to be perfect either. Perfection doesn't exist. Preference does. So, there's room for expression. With that in mind, if there's any topic in particular you'd like to discuss or ask more about with prose, feel free to comment below and let's get a conversation started. And if you'd like to gain further insight into knowledge on the writing side of storytelling, here's the playlist I have on prose that I kept promising throughout the video. I'm confident that I'll share things you either never heard, or, if you have, it'll make sense of why they're said.